This presentation, My Mother Wasn't Trash, a manifesto from Appalachia, is taken from 2 essays I wrote for my website, thisappalachialife.com. And about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, some of you might have remembered seeing my essay, My Mother Wasn't Trash. It was one of my first vulnerable blogs after I read Brene Brown's book about vulnerability. You all are social workers, so I'm certain you know Brene Brown's work. Love it or hate it, it encouraged me to be a little bit more vulnerable. And it was my way of sort of stepping out as a scholar and an academic to inject my own personal narrative. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about my personal narrative that is not evident probably from the fact that I'm in a nice office with lots of cool books and an espresso machine. I grew up dirt poor in a series of rental trailers in Western North Carolina. And we moved a lot, as a lot of impoverished people do, because the rent would come due and my parents couldn't pay the rent, my mother couldn't. And so we'd have to move somewhere else. And there were all the typical stigmas that you associate with growing up in an impoverished situation. I was made fun of a lot because I didn't have nice clothes and those sorts of things growing up. And as you might imagine, I started internalizing that white trash ideology. And so as a lot of people do, and I'm certain you work with people like this, and you may even be that person in your family, the goal is to distance yourself from your upbringing. Sometimes if you grow up in poverty, you want to get out of that because it's a source of shame to you, especially because we live in a society now where we like to blame poor people for their poverty and treat it as a character flaw rather than as evidence of a broken system. And so I very much internalized that idea that it was up to me to sort of fix myself. And even at some points, I would blame my family members for being poor and thinking, well, why can't you just stop being poor? And of course, later, I became an academic. I started studying Appalachian history systematically. I started to understand economic history. I started to study the history of capitalism. And I had this series of light bulb moments where I realized, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe there are some systemic issues here that need to be addressed. And so the essay, My Mother Wasn't Trash, was sort of my entrance into this world of vulnerability, where for the first time as a scholar, I reached out and embraced my history in a very real sort of way. And I was afraid because, as academics, we write things that are maybe kind of dry, but to us kind of interesting. And we publish those things and tens of people read those things. And I published this essay, and within about 2 months, 1 million people had read it. And at this point, about 3 million people have read the essay. I'll give you the link to it at the end of the presentation so you can read it for yourself. And so I was amazed at how many people resonated with this story. And I started getting all these interesting questions about my own story, about those sorts of things. And then this all coincided with the release and the popularity of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, which we talked about in the session yesterday. And I realize a lot of you have very strong feelings about. And so in some ways, not intentionally at all, I sort of became a voice in opposition to J.D. Vance's sort of victim blaming work, because I take a completely different approach to that and purport to come from sort of the same background as he does, although I don't think that's true. He might want to think that's true. And so I started giving this presentation in a variety of places. I gave it, for example, here on my own campus as part of our One Read initiative. We read 3 short stories from Appalachian writers. And so it is not as scholarly and academic as a lot of people are used to from my work, as you got yesterday, which is very much social science. This is more of a personal narrative that I use to contextualize my work as an historian. And so I'm going to screen share with you so you can see my presentation. Okay, can you all see my my presentation now? Perfect. I see the heads nodding. And so I always start out with this picture of my mother, Nancy Elizabeth Mull. She died on her 55th birthday, and she had about 56 cents in the bank. And she had an abscess in her lung the size of a softball that no one knew about. And she died peacefully in her sleep. She suffered from bipolar disorder and depression and anxiety for most of her life, and a variety of other health problems. And this is a picture of us on my wedding day. My mother, this was about a year and a half before she died. And for some reason, my mother always wanted me to get married. And I didn't get married until I was about 32. So in some ways, this was a really good day for my mother because I was finally getting married. And in her own way, she thought she was handing me off to my wife in a very gendered sort of way that I would not embrace in a typical definition. I don't think she quite understood whenever my wife, who's a clinical psychologist, didn't take my last name. And she certainly wouldn't understand that our son does not have either of our last names. I'm Wilkie, my wife's Aspinwall. People call us the Aspen Wilkies since we started dating, and so that's our son's last name, right? So anyway, I just wanted to share that picture because one of the things that I do intend to do, as Linda read from that introduction, I do intend to inject humanity into the study of Appalachia. And so what will follow is a series of, I call it a manifesto. It is 7 points that I think are absolutely essential for understanding and contextualizing the people that we call white trash. So the first thing I think we have to do is understand the power of the term white trash. And it makes some people really, really uncomfortable when I use that word. And I get a lot of pushback about this on my website. People, as you might imagine, email me quite frequently to say, hey, I should stop using that word because it's seen as a derogatory. And I get that, except that is a word, and I even capitalize it. It is a phrase that has been weaponized against so many people, me included, and against probably the populations that you all serve every day of your lives. It's a weaponized term that has some power. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that that phrase has power because it's meant to introduce an element of shame when you use it. You call someone white trash when you want to dehumanize them, whenever you want to insult them, when you want to imply that you are better than them. That's when you use the term white trash. And it makes people really uncomfortable when I say I'm white trash, because it's an acknowledgement that I know what you're doing when you use that phrase against me. And I think there's power in that. So there's power, I think, in using that phrase because it's a way of turning the script on its ear and saying, I see what you're doing when you call me that, and I'm smart enough to know that that's what you're doing, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. So when I embrace that, people cringe. And it's funny, some of you who have your cameras on, I see you cringing too when I say it. And I think that's a good thing because we say it so flippantly, so often, even jokingly, especially those of us who live in Appalachia. I say it too. I say that's a really white trash thing to do, right? It's just part of our vernacular. And I maybe tend to take a different approach. I like to make people uncomfortable. I think that it's like what they say about a good minister who can comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I think sometimes that's our job as scholars and activists, is to afflict the comfortable. And it is a cornerstone of my pedagogy when I teach. I want to ask hard questions that don't have obvious answers, but I want to skate on the edge of that uncomfortable, because that edge of uncomfortable represents our safety zone or our comfort zone, or the bounds of our knowledge or the bounds of our understanding. And I think the more we push that, the better off we are and the more vulnerable we can be with each other. And I think there's power in that. And so that leads me to My second point, this will probably be the most controversial thing. This is the thing I get a lot more pushback on than almost anything else I say. I think we have to understand the ways capitalism has continued to harm and oppress individuals in what I call white trash communities. And again, that on its surface seems like a political talking point, and yet I don't mean that as a political point at all. I mean that deeply as a scholarly point. We can observe capitalism at work in impoverished communities. And one of the things I think we have to realize is that it's actually really expensive to be impoverished. I'll give you an example from my mother's life. My wife and I, we're members of Sam's Club, and we go an hour away to Sam's Club about once a quarter, and we buy a whole SUV load of toilet paper and hand sanitizer and paper towels and all the other things that we just need, and we keep them in the in the pantry, and we always have an extra ketchup, and we always have an extra razor or an extra deodorant. We sort of live in this culture of abundance, but it's really cheap for us to do that. It's cheaper for us to buy 5 deodorants than to buy 1 deodorant 5 times at the Dollar General store. And that seems like such a basic thing for those of us who operate in that. And it would seem, right, that that's capitalism at work. Well, the other side of that is folks who live in a culture of scarcity, who operate under the laws of supply and demand. If you have to buy something somewhere that's not easy to get to, such as a rural community, and you have to only one source. In my session yesterday, we talked a good bit about the Dollar General store. How many of y'all live less than 3 miles from a Dollar General store? Yeah, it's incredibly common, right? And they spring up everywhere. And it seems like they spring up just, I'll drive down the road and next thing I know, there's a Dollar General there. And I'm like, where the heck did that come from? When did they even, it seems like they spring up like mushrooms after a rain. But if you look at where they're located, it's very intentional where they are located. And I think that's a fascinating point. How many of you all have ever swiped your debit card at a Dollar General? And what does it ask you? It asks you, would you like cash back? And there's an asterisk there at the end. You know what that says? A fee may apply. They will charge you $1 to get $10 cash back. So they charge you a 10% fee to access $10. Well, you may think, well, that's cool. That's what I do at an ATM too, except consider the core demographic of the Dollar General store. They are not people who can afford to give away 10% of their money for the privilege of getting that cash. And they know they have a captive audience. There's probably not a no-fee ATM nearby. And on top of that, their core demographic is unbanked. So they may be using a public benefits card, for example, to swipe at the Dollar General to get that $10 cash back. They may not have another way to get cash. And so we see examples like that. And you can do a price survey. Dollar General has really cool $1 things, but when it comes to essential items like food, they are certainly not as cheap as the grocery store. You pay an extra fee for that convenience of having it in your community. And so that's an example that I use. And my mother loved Dollar General store. She would go 2 or 3 times a day. And so every time I have to stop into the Dollar General, I can't help but think about my mom and in some ways smile, right? But in other ways, just kind of get pissed off to think how much more did it cost her to do that than if she could have gone to Sam's Club like we did, or if she could have afforded to pay for Amazon Prime. I don't know about y'all, but I live in rural America and I hate Jeff Bezos and Amazon, but you better believe that probably 5 days a week we get a box from UPS or the post office, right? And it's because we have the resources to do that. We have an Amazon credit card that we earn 5% cash back. We just operate in different worlds, right? So on the one hand, we see the power of capitalism to increase wealth. But on the other hand, when you think about how much it costs you to be poor, And then we think about other things like overdraft fees and all these other predatory lending practices that we see employed in impoverished communities. That's an example of harm and oppression in these communities because they're paying more for a lot of consumer goods than those of us who are not impoverished do, and they pay substantially more for financial services. I swipe my American Express everywhere I go. I rack up so many Delta Sky miles and so much cash back, but it's because I have the privilege of good credit, and I have the privilege of good credit because I don't live in these impoverished communities. And the APR on my American Express card is a whole lot lower than the APR on some secured $250 credit line credit card that a lot of impoverished people have. So when I say that, I would really encourage you to think about how capitalism is working against some of the communities you serve. And I don't mean to sound like a socialist or a radical, and I'm not trying to say I don't believe in capitalism. I'm simply pointing out that there are issues in our community that lead directly back to that. So the third point I would make is to understand the intergenerational nature of white trash poverty. The most guaranteed determinant of your socioeconomic status is the socioeconomic status of your parents at the time of your birth. Over and over again, economists argue that socioeconomic mobility is not a given, especially in our society. And what happens is that after generations and generations of poverty, we see all of these issues compounding. And so it becomes almost a given. And I'm certain that you guys see this in your everyday work. You go into a situation where there's an impoverished grandmother, an impoverished daughter, and then impoverished grandchildren who may share a nuclear household. And you realize there's a system at work here, and it's substantially less likely that these children in these situations will emerge from poverty. So if I think about my own situation, my mother grew up in a very poor family to an alcoholic SOB, and her mother, who's probably one of the most wicked people I would ever know. And that's my judgment that I'm inserting on them, right? But it's easy to look at this intergenerational poverty and even sort of get mad at people for birthing you into that situation. I've certainly had that frustration before in my life. And so I think it's very important for us to think about that intergenerational nature, because the question becomes, what do we do about it? There are no easy answers, but until we recognize that it's intergenerational and that it's assumed that children of impoverished families will be impoverished themselves. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Let me dismiss that. I think it's harder for us to understand what's going on. And so we sort of talked about this one a little bit. Understand that limited availability of healthy food and lack of access to medical care are major impediments to socioeconomic mobility for those in white trash communities. So when I think about my own mother who died in her sleep with, and so to tell you a little bit more about my mother, I mentioned that she suffered from bipolar disorder. On 2 occasions, I had to have her involuntarily committed to a mental health facility because she attempted suicide. And she attempted suicide several other times, and it was one of the things she struggled with. So when I got the call that my mother had died, it was easy for me to make that assumption that she died by suicide. And so, of course, because she had a mental health struggle, and because she had a history of that, the medical examiner said, we have to do an autopsy to determine cause of death. And I'm thinking, well, great, I was very upset by that. And the medical examiner called me back, and he said, I knew within the first 5 minutes of the autopsy that she died of natural causes because she had literally a softball-sized abscess in her lung. And it made me think, if she had access to better health care, would she have lived longer? Would it not have become a softball-sized abscess? But she was on Medicaid, but I don't know how it is in West Virginia, but in Western North Carolina, it's incredibly difficult to find practitioners who will accept new Medicaid patients. It's almost impossible to find reliable mental health services in the rural area of the country where I live. And you know, as a household where one of us is a mental health practitioner, my wife's not in private practice. She's the clinical director at a university counseling center. But when we think about lack of access to food, it compounds the issue of lack of access to affordable and quality healthcare, or even healthcare in general, even crappy healthcare. It's hard to find access to those sorts of things. But I think that's in some ways related to the Dollar General conversation that we were having. I would challenge anyone to go to the Dollar General store and for any amount of money find enough meals for a 24-hour period that have less than the recommended daily allowance of sodium, for example. You can't do it because all the food they sell there, cheap food in general, has high sodium content, which leads to high blood pressure, which leads to heart disease, which leads to all these other issues. You know, I struggle with obesity, and part of that was when I was growing up, I ate lots of really cheap, crappy food. Macaroni and cheese and hot dogs is dirt cheap, and it's terrible for you. And then combine that with this culture of scarcity where you don't always have enough to eat. Well, all of a sudden, when you have not unlimited resources, but I can have anything I want to eat now, and it's still hard for me. You know, it takes some psychotherapy to break out of that phase of eat everything I can because I can have it now, right? All these sorts of things that you're denied all of your life start to add up, and you establish these habits early in life. I love high sodium food. I have to take a blood pressure pill because that's what I'm attuned to eating. But part of that traces back to the fact that that's what's available. And of course, I'm an educated person with access to Trader Joe's and an organic garden that I grow myself, and free range chickens and meat that we grow on the farm, and all the honey I want. But every once in a while, I still want some chicken McNuggets, right? And it's because you have these patterns that develop in childhood. And I think that it's incredibly important for us to recognize that. And so somebody else, a couple of people have said in the comments that transportation is a huge barrier, and that is so important in rural areas. So if you're impoverished and you live in a city center, there's probably reliable public transportation that may even have a discount for people on public assistance. But I live up the holler, and I'm not walking to the grocery store because it's a mile away, but it is not an easy mile. It is really steep up and down, and there's sure as heck not any sidewalks where I live. I don't know about y'all. Here on campus, we have beautiful sidewalks. They end at the city limits, right? So you can't walk to those places except Dollar General. There's conveniently a Dollar General located at a trailer park near you, right? You're going to find the Lotto and the cigarette store, and you're going to find the ABC store, and you're going to find the Dollar General near the trailer parks, right? That's certainly what we had available when we were kids, except it wasn't Dollar General. It was Family Dollar or Maxway or some other chain when I was a kid, but it was, you know, same song, previous verse. And so a lot of you are chiming in that, especially when you have places that have floods and natural disasters, as are incredibly common in West Virginia and in central Appalachia, especially in areas where mountaintop removal coal mining changes the topography of the land and makes floods more frequently. It is like mushrooms after a rain, or it's like dandelions in your yard in the spring. Those weeds are the first things that pop up. And it's because they're taking advantage of that, right? The first tree that sprouts up after a clear-cutted forest is probably the one that's going to be the tallest in 15 years. Dollar General's the same way. They sprout up in these communities and they become affluent because they're taking advantage of a situation where there's a vacuum there. And all of that combines, right, to this lack of healthy food, which leads to poorer health outcomes, which lead to suffering because of lack of access to mental and physical health care. And so if you can't be healthy mentally and you can't be healthy physically, it's very hard for you to ascend out of poverty. And I would also argue if you're not healthy spiritually, that's a topic, fundamentalist religion's a topic for another presentation that I do at a different time. Maybe I'll do that one next year, right? Number 5, this one is really important to me. So what made me think of this one is I was driving down the road one day, and I saw at a trailer down the road from us a goat tied out in the yard of a trailer with trash strewn all around it. And I went home and I said to my wife, Betsy, I said, did you see that goat down there at the trailer? And she said, yeah, the one out in the yard. I was like, yeah, in the house with the Confederate flag hanging from the tree. And we both looked at each other and kind of laughed, like, what would your parents in the suburbs of Madison, Wisconsin think of this place, right? But in some ways, it made me think of, and I feel shame about this too. I haven't cut my grass in 2 weeks, and I feel really crappy about it because it makes me think I'm not proud of my property and I'm not taking care of it. And I always wonder when I see like the trailer with the goat tied up in the yard and the trash everywhere, their last 2 washing machines are on the porch broken. And I think, why can't you just do better? Well, they don't have a working vehicle. They don't have a truck. There's not regular garbage service. It's not that they have lack of pride. It's that they're freaking worn out at the end of a crappy 10-hour day working for $7.15 an hour or whatever their near minimum wage job is. So sometimes we translate that into a lack of pride. And I think that's very important because we say, for example, in Central Appalachia, why can't people just be proud of who they are and where they come from? Why do they junk up their communities? Or why do they junk up their bodies? Or why do they junk up their arms with those needle marks? Why do they junk up their lives with drugs? It's because they're worn out and they're hopeless. That's often a major source of that sort of thing that we see exhibited in these people. I think it's incredibly important for us to understand what hopelessness and exhaustion look like in concert with one another and how we interpret that through our lenses of privilege. We have to check our own privilege. We have the equipment and the free time. I work a lot in my job, especially at times when we have deadlines here on campus, or so I'm an administrator in academic affairs, and I'm in charge of accreditation and assessment in academic affairs. So we're building the schedule for the spring semester, and I'm having to schedule classrooms for social distancing. I'm really busy, right? I just turned in our SAC-COC 10-year reaffirmation report. If you're in academia, you know what that is. Things are busy for me, but also I took a vacation day on Tuesday, and I'm taking 3 vacation days next week. And guess what? I'm getting paid for those. I'm compensated really well for what I do. Of course, never enough. We're always complaining about salaries in higher ed, but I'm certainly making more than the people in the trailer down the road with the goat in the yard, right? And I get to take time off, and I get to pay for my child to go to a wonderful daycare where he learns really awesome things. And, I get like 22 vacation days a year, and I can afford a nice tractor to mow my grass with. And if I don't have time to mow it, I can pay somebody to come and do it, right? So all of these things that I may be too exhausted to do, I have the resources to do. We have somebody, and it seems like such an epitome of privilege, and we're not. We're just solidly middle-class people. We pay somebody to clean the house every 2 weeks because we're too tired to do it with a toddler around, and both of us working as college administrators, right? It's not that we are any less tired necessarily than other people, but we have the resources where we can demonstrate our pride in our community by paying somebody else to take care of it in many instances. And so quite often when we see that those dirty yards, those dirty cars, those dirty children, they're just tired and hopeless. And one of the things that I say about people that I've learned through thinking critically about my mother's story since the time of her death is this. There are sometimes no good choices to be had when you're impoverished. And there may be better choices, but sometimes you have, I'll just use the profane way I describe it. If you have a series of shitty choices and you have to choose the one that's the least shitty, and you compound that over 10 years, where you took maybe the least shitty of an array of really shitty options, you're still not having good options because that's not part of the system in which you live. And that wears you out eventually. And when you eventually realize that no matter what you do, it's just never going to get any better and you're never going to get any traction, then that's when you have that exhaustion combined with the hopelessness. And the reality is, in our current economic system for impoverished people, if they work 2 jobs at minimum wage, they still can't make it in most communities. They can't afford safe and reliable housing. They can't afford quality food. They can't afford so many of the important things that are necessary as tools of upward mobility. And I think that's incredibly important for us to think about. So sometimes we fault everyone for having that lack of pride, but I think we need to think about the whole situation. I see that someone in the chat asked about the handout being available. I will actually share my PowerPoint in just a little bit with the group. I said yesterday, I generally don't send my PowerPoints out ahead of time, and it's not that I care for anyone to have them or use them or for them to be posted online. It's that I tweak them literally up into the minute I present usually. I switched out 3 or 4 of my slides just 5 minutes before my presentation. I was sitting here sipping my coffee, about to share my screen, and I switched a map out yesterday. So I'll send this to you, and then I'll send it to the conference folks and let them make it available to you. So number 6, and we sort of talked about this a little bit, understand that impoverished people lack access to many of the mechanisms designed for socioeconomic improvement. Education is chief among them. I wish, I committed to no maps, so I'm not gonna open my other PowerPoint and show it to you, but educational attainment in Central Appalachia is a stunningly depressing reality that we have to face. And a lot of people lack access to that. And a lot of poor people, we talked about this a little yesterday too, we have this stupid idea in the United States that we need to fund our schools based on ad valorem property taxes, which means the poorer a community, the less money available for schools, when they in fact need the most money. If you live in a wealthy suburb, you have a really bougie school district who does really cool things and can be really experiential and afford all these awesome things for students. If you live in a desperate community, there's a lack of access to quality schools. And in so many places in Central Appalachia, I lived in Bell County, Kentucky for 7 years. There are 3 independent school districts in that county. There's the 2 cities in the county, which are both small towns, have independent school districts. And then there's a county school system. All 3 of them are underfunded. And of course, they don't meet expectations and they don't produce college-ready students because they just don't have the resources. Students who go to a rural high school who have maybe AP literature, and if they're lucky, an AP history class, cannot compete with students from affluent school districts that can take all AP classes the last year of their high school experience. They can't have as high a GPA because they just don't have those weighted advanced placement classes. And if that were the case even, impoverished students, we know, have lower educational outcomes unless they have the extra support built into the education system. And Danielle, you're exactly right. It's a catch-22 across the board. Sabrina notes that her first high school had 200 students in it. Absolutely. With 200 students, you just can't have the numbers it takes to have so many of these extra resources. You wouldn't have an AP literature class make because there just aren't enough students. And especially if it's impoverished, you don't even have enough students reading at grade level in 9th grade to get them to the point of being AP ready or even being college ready, which means that they may drop out of high school anyway, because they're not extra resources to focus on those sorts of things. And so a lot of you are noting in the comments all of the things that your education system lacked. And I think it's incredibly important for us to realize that lack of access to education. And of course, I'm going to say this, right? Because I'm an educator who is a strong cheerleader for first-generation college students. My mother went to a technical college and got a degree in secretarial work. But I was the first one in my family to get a bachelor's degree. I was certainly the first one, I was the only one in my family to ever get a master's degree or a doctorate or do any postgraduate work. But I had access at age 31 to college. That was the first time I could afford in my life to go to college. How would my life be different now if I had those 10 extra years? I'd be a college president now, right? Which is what I aspire to be eventually. I'm going to be there about 10 years later because I didn't have access to those mechanisms earlier in life. And the hard reality, and I hit my teacher candidate students with this all the time, I didn't get as much attention in school because I lived in the trailer park. And my parents couldn't afford the tutoring. And I got bullied on the bus for getting dropped off at the trailer, right? All those sorts of things led me to love learning, but be a really crappy student. I made D's all through high school in math classes because they told me early on, well, math's just not your thing. So I internalized that and thought I was terrible at math. And so I was scared to death that math would be the thing at age 31 that kept me from completing a college degree. Well, it turns out that I have doctoral work in statistical methods now, and I use advanced level mathematics every day in my work as a statistician who works in institutional effectiveness. So it makes me want a middle finger, right, to that guidance counselor in high school who said, math's just not your thing. Well, you were wrong. It was not your thing to invest in me. And it's not about me. It's about every other student in Appalachia who faces that, who never gets to realize that there's a Berea College out there, or there's a Brevard College out there, or there's a Western Carolina University, or there's a West Virginia University that has a place for you and resources to help you succeed. I realize, I was making sure I'm good on time because I tend to, I'm not teaching this semester, and I didn't teach last semester because of administrative duties. And so this to me is one of my opportunities to teach. And as you can tell, this is sort of my native habitat, and I really enjoy this. So I tend to go at it. So here is the big number 7. Understand that while your sympathy and charity might be welcomed and appreciated, only systemic changes will ever truly help impoverished people. That's hard. It's especially hard for those of you who work in helping professions, because it's your job every day of your life to help individuals, to help single humans out of their circumstances. But if you're able to elevate that one human out of their emergent circumstances, and yet you release them back into a broken system, what's going to happen? It's like having the hip replacement without the physical therapy that follows. We're not that good at that. So you all are doing the societal and cultural work of hip replacements without being able to empower many of your clients to have that physical therapy afterward. And that's a problem, right? So I think that we have to consider very carefully what our role is in advocating for systemic change. And because I think that's the thing that hasn't happened in Appalachia in decades and decades and decades of trying. Because it was very easy for me with my mother, once I became middle class, to hand her a $100 bill or to pay for her car insurance. But I couldn't fix the broken system in which she worked. I couldn't fix her access to mental health care. Even if I could pay for whatever she needed for mental health care, I was really happy to pay for therapy. She couldn't get individualized therapy because there weren't enough practitioners in our rural community. She couldn't get the inpatient care she needed, even if I would pay for it, because there were no beds available. She was very low on the list of severity. She was fleetingly in crisis. She would switch to a new medication, and in 2 weeks she was stabilized again. But she needed those systematic forms of help that just weren't available in our community. I realized that group psychotherapy is a powerful tool. She hated it because she was ashamed by it. And there was no option for her in the community other than group. Group was the only thing available to her. And she could go to the doctor and get symptoms treated, but she didn't have the availability to go with any sort of regularity. It was hard to get her to see specialists. She could drive, but she had to take pain control medicine that made her unfit to drive, so I had to take the keys away and say, sorry, Mom. And then I'd have to take a day off work to take them. So we see all of these sorts of things that are issues that deal with a broken system. She had severe back pain because she had to work at a gas station whenever I was younger. And one of the things she had to do was lift the tank covers out to dip and measure the tank every night. Well, she strained her back and blew out a disc and had a lifelong problem based on it was probably a $4 or $5 an hour job then, right? So we see all these systemic changes that compound. And so it's easy to look at someone like my mother in the last couple of years of her life and think, wow, what the hell happened that got you to this point? It wasn't just one thing or two or three things. As historians, one of the things we talk about is multiple causality. The idea that, so historical contingency is the idea that things happen because other things happened. And then multiple causality is the idea that multiple things happen to lead to an eventuality. And it's impossible to separate out all of those things that happen to lead to a given situation. But all of those things, at least socially, are part of a system. And it's a system in which we operate. And I guarantee you, if I asked you all to make a list of all of the systemic problems that you confront as social workers in West Virginia, you all would be singing to the choir, but you all know what the issues are. And yet, your daily job is not always just to fix those problems in the system. You're too busy swimming along, probably serving your clients, to advocate for change necessarily. And I'm certain that you have lobbying efforts and whatever to confront the need for systemic change. But that's the only hope we ever have of prosperity in our communities, or just survival. Because as you all know, many of you probably live in communities that are dying. Is that a fair thing to say? When I lived in Eastern Kentucky, the community was dying. It was losing 10% of its population about every 7 years. And when those communities die, they don't come back. And yesterday I talked about, I keep referencing yesterday, and I realized that there are like 122 people here now, and there were 75 people here yesterday. So I apologize if I keep referencing yesterday. I'm happy to share yesterday's PowerPoint with you all too, because I think it will provide you some data as contextualization for this. But so let's say you have a town of 10,000 people, and let's say 2,500 of them are impoverished, and you lose 10% of your population. So you have 9,000 people. Who leaves? It's not the impoverished people. It's those who have the resources to leave. Those who have an education, those who have some money saved up, those who have the ability to move somewhere else, leave. But not those who have disabilities necessarily, or those who are in poor health, or those who are not impoverished. So then you have a community of 9,000 people, but you still have 2,500 impoverished people. Then you lose another 10%, and you have 8,100 people, but you still have 2,500 impoverished people. And that's why you're seeing your communities die, because what's leaving, and the people that are voting with their feet, and the humans that are Appalachia's biggest export, are young people and people with resources, and they just leave. And so what we're left with is increasingly impoverished communities. And you can anecdotally look at, you know what the communities are. You can name them, I'm certain, the communities in your region that are dying. And I think it's important for us to realize only systemic changes will address that. Yeah, you're right, Jay Forrester. Impoverished and older populations, which are the harder to serve. And I guarantee you that you guys are probably not getting new resources at your agencies. Probably. Is that a fair thing to say? Resources are always an issue. And so how can you be expected to do your job without adequate resources? If you can barely do your job, you certainly can't advocate for systemic change because you don't have additional resources. And I'm just jaded enough to think maybe you don't have the additional resources because people don't want social workers to have the capital and the time to go out there and burn the system down and build a new one. I can say that, right? Because I'm not a social worker, and I don't I don't have to answer to that. I can say that I firmly believe that if social workers were given the keys to the kingdom, they'd burn the system down and build a new one that more adequately and equitably represented every human. Really good point that political systems rarely represent the poor. They're not designed to. It is not a bug or a flaw in the system. It's a feature of the system to disenfranchise those. If the peasants ever get pitchforks, they're going to burn the courthouse down, right? If you've ever studied, I hate to even say this out loud, but if you've ever studied Karl Marx, he understands, right, that he calls them the lumpenproletariat, the people who are so disenfranchised and so resourceless that they're never going to be able to advocate for any sort of meaningful economic reform. And the thing about it is, if you look at economic theory in Africa, Frantz Fanon, who was an Algerian activist, said, wait a minute, maybe it's the lumpenproletariat who need to have the most power. Maybe we need to empower them to make sure they are represented in the entire scheme of things. And it's essentially the lumpenproletariat, to use Marx's term, that you all deal with mostly on a daily basis. Those people don't necessarily lack agency, they just lack opportunity to exercise that agency. And so maybe if we look at it that way, how can we help the people we serve exercise the agency they already have? We might change the paradigm of how we think about our service to people like my mother. And so we'll open it up for questions, but I wanted you to see my mother's obituary here at the end, and I'll just be silent for a minute and let you read it. Sorry if I made you cry early in the morning. So that to me is the vulnerability that I think we have to share with one another. I think it's important for us to think about the fact that every human we serve has a story like this. They don't all have sons who write for a living and can write an elegy, right? But they all have stories, and we are not good at taking care of the most vulnerable people in our communities. And those of us who have vulnerable people in our families are not always good at taking care of them ourselves, right? Because we're so busy living the life. Those of us who climbed out of poverty don't like to go back there on vacation. And that's what it feels like we're doing sometimes when we visit our family members. And so it's a real struggle for us. Yeah. So I'm going to stop my share. Again, I will send you all the PowerPoint. There we go. Now you can see my face and I can see more of you all. Who has questions or comments or observations? And you can actually use the raise hand feature virtually if you'd like. And I can call on you to speak or chime in or whatever. Or as Danielle notes, you can, Faye, I see you raising.
At this point, if we could stop the video.
To some of the power that I've seen.
Yeah, I guess so, because it is pre-recorded, right?
So the most underprivileged as we've gone through this pandemic. So many of them are like, oh, listen, we've been practicing this for a long time. Like, come down to where we are. You know, like, keep it simple. You know, stay home with your kids. Don't go places. Be used to spending time at home with your kids. Use the resources.
Sorry, do we want to stop and go to questions, or
yeah, that would be great if you could stop the video.
This back to simplicity, I think that all of us have had to do, like,
yeah.
Yeah, it's on your end, I believe, Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Adapted so well and being able to, so there is a lot of resilience and that, you know, speaking to the determination and their will to thrive. And sometimes it's just, you know, bringing their level of awareness up that, you know, sometimes
I don't know that I have.
We can.
Actually, Peter, I think maybe an easy way for you to do it is to stop sharing on Zoom. That might take care of it.
Children, and she's really on her own because the court system has terminated the screen. You know, and she's trying to get on her feet. She's trying to overcome addiction, and it's just sometimes just encouraging that spirit of resilience for them.
And asking what they need. I
think you might have to scroll over to the top.
She didn't want a $100 bill or for me to pay her car insurance, for me to buy her groceries. She wanted me to listen to her.
That's just stopping recording on the cloud. Is that right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it may be on the bottom of your screen too.
That's what I'm saying. I see the screen share. Screen share one participant.
We just choose sometimes to ignore those skills because we don't think we think we have a better way. Because clearly we're doing better, right? But until we take those vulnerable skills inventories of the people we serve, they have toolboxes. We just use the tools that are in their box to work on.
Looks like we'll still have plenty of time to to questions from this group.
Tools along the way, but we don't need to throw out the tools they already have because those are the tools they've honed from years and years and years of having to suffer.
I'm a co-host, not the host, so I think
decisions
whoever the host is can do that. I don't think I can.
Let me see. NASW wv3 is the host.
Right, and I think that's Brian.
So you should be able to do it.
Sorry?
That is, it's an initiative amongst several agencies within the state. I believe that it's targeting mostly for folks who have some type of legal issue.
Feels like we're time traveling, Casey. You're right.
It's unpaid tickets, fines, and
yeah, I'm not sure who on your end is playing the video.
I
think it's Brian. So let me try to get in touch.
We kind of have inroads now for a lot of connectivity for folks to kind of get some of those barriers.
And I promise we'll have plenty of time for questions in the present.
Yeah, we got plenty of time. We got another half hour or so.
Right. You'll see some of your colleagues and maybe some of yourselves from December, I guess, was when we did this last.
Yeah. Like I said, we know what the issue is.
And you don't know about who can help.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. We have about 4 more minutes. Is there... Hano, did I say your name correctly?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm thinking too, the pandemic crisis is...
I think this was a shorter presentation last year. We didn't have this much time.
He's here. This guy's here.
It's plunging more people into this kind of abject poverty that we were talking about.
And I also, in the video, kept referencing yesterday. I actually gave 3 presentations at the last conference, and I only gave this one pre-recorded this time. So,
who benefits most?
One of them was very data-driven. I think I bored people with 25 or 30 maps.
And the rich.
Absolutely. Right. And even the middle class. I mean, our $600 a month student loan payment has been deferred for almost a year, and we're both still getting to count toward our public service loan forgiveness every month.
There, I got it. I got its number now. Sorry about that.
And we're not getting the benefits, like you said, Hano. Did I say your name correctly, Hano? It's that political disenfranchisement. It's intentional. I'm I'm jaded enough to say
Hey,
that it's
Brian.
absolutely intentional.
Hey, we want to stop the video, but I'm a co-host and not a
Who
host.
has the gold makes the rules, and I
So
say
we need to stop the video
intentionally,
and
not as an attempt to not be gender neutral. It is generally he, right?
that's an L3. Oh, looks like it's done.
Oh, there we go.
All right, thanks, buddy. Bye. All right, Brian.
There we go,
Connor.
and we're all together now.
Yay.
And now I'm going to get out of full screen mode. There, so here I am in the present dimension instead of the 7 or 8 months ago dimension. And I was trying to follow along with the chat, and I made a few notes of some things that I think you all might want to talk about. And looks like we have about a half an hour before the session wraps up. So hopefully we can get to your questions and concerns. So in this dimension, I will say hello again. You can tell that I am actually at home today instead of in my office. And as you know from seeing the presentation, I'm Joshua Wilkie. I'm the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs at Brevard College in Western North Carolina. And I see your suggestion, William, and that is very kind. But unless the devil has donned ice skates or the pigs out in my pasture are flying, I don't think that's going to happen. Me running for office, William suggested I run. Oh, by the way, though, for those of you who don't know, J.D. Vance is running for the Senate in the great state of Ohio. It was announced recently. So for those of you who are J.D. Vance fans or frenemies, right? He is going to run for office. I'm fascinated, by the way, in watching the closed captioning on this. Between my academic jargon and my Appalachian accent, it's fascinating to watch the way it's translating me on the bottom. And so in a couple of places, I tried to put the jargon I was meaning to say in the chat, because I watched some of you all start Googling as I would say things or mention writers or authors. So I tried to put those in the chat as we could. So maybe the first thing I want to talk about is, well, actually, Valicia, did I say your name correctly?
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about J.D. Vance, and I think that's an apropos thing to talk about, right? Because now, since this presentation, since I did it initially, the time of this recording, the film has come out, and I will admit that I've read the book 2 or 3 times, but I've not watched the film. I think humanization is deeply important. And you know, as I sort of explained in the video previously, I think it's important that we weaponize that term. And I just think, and this is my take on it, your mileage may vary. I think when you show someone that you know what they're doing by calling you that phrase, they realize that you actually are capable of thinking for yourself. And you're smart enough to understand when someone is trying to bully or manipulate you. And so I think the most important thing we can do is to call those people out who use that term in a derogatory way and say, hey, here I am. And, you know, white trash people, as it were, are not monolithic. They're not unchanging. They are, you know, from a variety of different backgrounds and have a variety of different challenges. And I think the best thing we can do is look at each person who's been branded with that epitaph as a human being or as a child of God, or however your worldview pushes you to look at other human beings. I think that's deeply important. And so that actually sort of relates to a couple of the other things that I wrote down from the chat while we were talking. This idea of, I think the way I put it in the at the end is it feels like we're going back to impoverishment on vacation when we go back home. I'm pretty lucky in that I still live in my hometown. I left for a while to move to Central Appalachia from Southern Appalachia. But the curse, sort of, when you become the first in your family to be educated, is that you really don't fit in at home anymore in a lot of ways. But also, you don't ever fully fit in the educated world either, because you're always the white trash or the hillbilly or the hick, right? And your classmates like like to joke with you about that. And yeah, imposter syndrome is exactly right. I wrote an essay about that I share with my first year experience students every semester, because we tend to serve in small colleges in Appalachia a lot of students who have never been to college before and have no access to any sort of knowledge bank or shared experience with their family about higher education. I tell the story sometimes whenever the day I learned I was admitted to my dream doctoral program at the University of Alabama, I called my dad to share the news. My mother had already died at that point. And I said, Dad, I got into the doctoral program at the University of Alabama. And the first thing he said to me was, well, does that mean y'all are moving? Not congratulations, and not I'm proud of you. But his primary concern was whether or not I was going to move. And I thought, I didn't think of it at the time. I was kind of hurt at the time. But I thought later, this is a really good example of the thing we talk about how folks from Appalachia who go on to attain an education end up living in this liminal space where they're not ever bona fide educated adults, operating as academics, but they're also not ever anymore bona fide people from up the holler anymore, right? And I still live up the holler. For those of you who are familiar with that expression, for those of you who are from the city, a holler is a sort of a depression between two mountains with a dead end. And to me, it's where you find paradise. And it's where you find the farm on which my little family lives. But the mentality is different, right? Because I'm always the educated one. And some of you all mentioned that in the comments, that you have felt that sort of disconnect with your family when you become the educated one. And, where do you fit in? It's very hard. And so it leads us to code switching. And one of the things that you probably notice about me is that I retain my Appalachian accent. And I will tell you, 15 years ago, I had trained myself completely out of it. And I tried to be completely neutral in my speech when I realized that was a part of my identity that I didn't need to give up, because I needed to be proud of who I was and where I was from. And sometimes there's some pushback. And then I will tell you that if you were to hear me speak to my father, I still sound a little bit different, right? If I pick up the phone, I still sound like I'm a good old boy, because I am, right? And so we have a toddler, my wife and I. She's from Madison, Wisconsin. I'm from up the holler in Western North Carolina. And so our child, who is 2.5 years old almost, it's interesting to see how he speaks. I don't know yet. The jury's out on whether or not he will sound Appalachian or not. We'll see. But that led to the other thing from the chat. And then I promise I'm going to take some more of your questions. The idea of survivor's guilt. Those of us who have ascended from poverty feeling guilty as heck that we got out and our family members didn't. That is a very real burden and a very hard thing to carry. And I know some of you all deal with that. I'm certain that there are people who are present on this Zoom meeting who deal with that guilt, that survivor's guilt. And I don't have an easy answer for that, of how we handle that, right? It's a hard thing to do. And I think so. It's kind of a catch-22, right? It's hard for you to advocate for change for the people you love without having ascended out of poverty. So either you've ascended to a place that makes you feel guilty, but from which you have some power and privilege to advocate for change, or you remain mired in the same poverty that your loved ones are in. I don't know the easy answer to that. So, but thank you for asking about that and bringing it up, right? So now, is there someone who would like to ask a real live question? If you want to just use the raise hand feature, I'd be happy to sort of call you out and give you the chance to ask a question.
People have a lot of comments throughout the presentation.
Yes, I was trying to look at the chat. I really appreciate those of you who shared some vulnerability. I said that at the beginning. I think that is incredibly important and powerful. And I'll reference Brene Brown again. I had never read Brene Brown until I started dating a psychologist to whom I've now been married for 7 years. And she made me read Brene Brown. And I grumbled all the way through it until it clicked and it changed my mind, or changed my life, right? And so now we're
wonderful.
trying to teach our toddler, to be vulnerable. So any questions? By the way, somebody said in the chat just now that they enjoyed Hillbilly Elegy until the end of the book. I would agree with that too. Unfortunately, I read the last chapter of the book first because historians tend to do that, right? We read the last chapter, we read the first chapter, and we may or may not read what's in the middle. It was a powerful story, right? And so I have some critiques of J.D. Vance because I think in some ways he appropriates Appalachian culture, and I don't know how I do know how I feel about that, right? I think that one who grew up in Central Ohio with a family that has roots in Appalachia and went to visit on summers and long weekends and holidays does not have the same lived experience as someone who lived in Eastern Kentucky for their entire life. The fact that his family was able to move out of the region is testament to the fact that he had some resources that the people he often criticizes as having a broken culture tend to lack. On the Glass Castle, I'm trying to think, give me a little context. I don't know that that's a book, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that I have read that.
It's a lady from McDowell County, and she lived in Welch, West Virginia.
Oh, well, I don't know that I've read that, but I'm going to have to.
In McDowell County, she came out of poverty, and I think she's now an author living in New York.
Oh, okay.
Very good book.
I'm going to have to, I have realized that having a toddler has completely changed the way I used to read. I used to burn through 3 books a week, and sometimes I'll listen to an audiobook on my commute to work, but it's funny. I was looking at the video from last year. I'm preparing to move to a different office because I was not the associate dean when I took that video, but I'm about to move to a different office, and I'm looking at my bookshelves and I'm thinking, okay, I've read very few books this year, but there's so many more books on my bookshelf now. So now I'm going to buy Glass Castle and add that to it too. So stay tuned. How about that? And I will say also, thank you all for the really kind comments in the chat. So last conference was my first time presenting to a social work conference. I very frequently will guest lecture to the Masters of Social Work program at Western Carolina University, which is the institution from which I received my bachelor's and my master's. They teach a rural social work class, and I generally go at least once a semester there to guest lecture to that class. So I was not a stranger to speaking to social workers, but I have to say, out of all the conferences I went to last year, this was one of my favorites. And so I was delighted this year when they asked if they could play one of my videos and I could come and answer some questions in person.
In some things with that that book, I kind of agreed with some of it, some of it I didn't, because, I live 45 minutes from Welch.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it was good, but I don't know, it just disturbed me.
Yeah, and I
don't know if I can't get into words what I want to say,
Sure, yeah. I push my students to think like that, to think not, is this a good book or is this a bad book, but what makes you think and what makes you uncomfortable about this book. And I think that's incredibly important to think about.
Well, Judy, what was it about the book that you think that was that moved you on that?
Well, she came out of poverty. I understand that. I know where she lived, all of that. But at the end, I got a feeling she was kind of bragging about what she had. I can't.
No, I understand. Sure. Was it bragging or proud?
Both ways, I suppose, but maybe it's the way I took it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Felicia made a good point in the chat that there are a lot of really good books that represent Appalachia better than J.D. Vance. I agree with that completely. And if any of you are into fiction, I would recommend the work of David Joy, Davidjoy. I'll put his name in the chat. He is a phenomenal writer. And so his latest book is called When These Mountains Burn. It's about addiction in Southern Appalachia, but it's a really good fictional representation. And so I think David Joy, and I think Ron Rash does a really good job too. I think those are some really good examples. And if you're interested in reading lists, thisappalachialife.com is my website. I haven't updated it in a woeful amount of time, but I'm gonna type it in here. Oh, I love Robert Greig. So if you're interested in some reading lists, I tend to put a lot of them on my website. I have a couple of Appalachia reading lists. I have an American South reading list. I have a poverty reading list. And I think there's still a tab on the top of the homepage that just has reading lists. So if you're into that, I love sharing reading. Okay, so Casey has a question. What would be your advice for someone dealing with ambivalence towards sharing the story of poverty? There's a desire to move on from it on the one hand and the desire to own it and come to terms. What are your thoughts on how one comes to terms or comes to reconcile that ambivalence? How did you grow more comfortable in sharing your story? And what was that process like for you? A very important question. The number one thing I would say to you is wait until you are in a good mental health space before you share that. And if you still have some mental health work to do to get you past, whatever your situation is, share that story in writing if you're ready, but don't do it publicly until you're ready to face the backlash. Very frequently, I get terrible emails via my website from people who don't agree with what I have to say and who criticize me because of it. And especially on Facebook, right? Whenever you post things on Facebook, the keyboard experts are going to come at you. And writing is an incredibly therapeutic thing. I think that's incredibly important. And so maybe the advice I would give Casey is go ahead and write your story and don't publish it until you're ready. But there is some catharsis in writing your story out there. And I will say that for most of you all, the right time will come to share your story. And you also get to, it's your story and you get to have ownership of it, which means you get to control the audience that consumes it too. And so sometimes there's power in that. I will say I have gotten a substantial amount of pushback from some members of my family for telling my mother's story. Her sister and I are not on speaking terms because she still has that internalized shame from impoverishment. And she wants to pretend that they were actually not impoverished and they didn't actually grow up in an abusive household. And my mother didn't struggle with addiction to drugs. None of that, that is all the truth, but she refuses to acknowledge it. And she thinks that in some way I'm doing a disservice to my family and my community by being candid about those things. And, the sense of Appalachian shame is strong.
Angela's Ashes came out a few years ago, and it was the same thing about the Irish. I mean, it's just, it was kind of the unwritten rule that nobody talks outside the family, and so I think a lot of this with Vance's and your own work kind of goes against that creed.
Yes.
In the same way. So yeah, you're
yes,
gonna have
and it is yes, and I will say it is an historical Appalachian value to be clannish. As much as we like to pretend that's actually not one of our characteristics as a culture, it is in fact, it is deep rooted. As a matter of fact, those of us who have Scots-Irish background come from a place where the word clan was the word we used to describe our familial units, right? And so I see that clannishness coming out, and being, it's the other thing that I tell all my first year students, right? The term criticism, when I say that, I mean that in a scholarly sense. I don't mean that as in, fussing at someone or shaming them or putting them on blast, as the kiddos say, right? I'm not nearly young enough or cool enough to say that, I don't think. But, it's okay to criticize someone because it means thinking critically about it. There's good and bad aspects to criticism. And I think that if there's ever any hope for us to improve our communities from within, we have to be critical of it and say, I love you, but that doesn't mean blind allegiance or blind agreement with everything you say or do. We have to be better about talking about our differences in our communities. We are not good at that. And we're in a political space now that makes that even more difficult. I think if we were better at having civil conversations about the ways we disagree, I think we could have conversations about poverty a lot better. Yes, I have seen the whites of West Virginia, and I kind of stub up when you ask about it, right? Because I'm like, it looks like poverty porn to me. That's sort of what I call things that fit into that category. I call it poverty porn because people love to see it, because in some ways it's kind of like Schadenfreude, right? This idea that I may be in a bad place, but at least I'm not them, right? I think.
Do you see somebody? You see somebody posting about the wonderful whites of West by God, Virginia here?
Yeah, that's what I was just talking about. Is yeah, and it looks like Amanda, you have a hand up.
I was just gonna say it's kind of like I've always said. There's some family, like, you love all your family, but there's some that you don't like because of the choices they make. And it's kind of that scenario, because you really do love them and you want the best for them, but you kind of have to tell them, like, I don't like the person that you're becoming, but I still love you.
Yeah, and I confront this all the time, because loving someone doesn't mean blindly believing everything they say or blindly agreeing with everything they do. My mother and I had this conflict constantly throughout her life, because she said, well, if you love me, you have to agree with me or whatever. And I was like, Mom, that's not an operable definition of the word love. And then I say, what kind of conversations did you have with me when I was a kid doing dumb stuff? It's the same thing, right? Oh, Kelly, you talk about the people of Walmart too. Yes, it drives me batty. Yeah. So one of the things that one of the examples I use, I used it in one of the presentations that I did last year that we didn't repeat this year, was the Appalachian Emergency Room skit from Saturday Night Live. Any of you all remember that? It's on YouTube now, so you ought to see if you can find it. It's every disgusting caricature of Appalachia, from violence to sexual perversion to drug abuse, all wrapped into one 10-minute skit on popular Saturday night television, and the power in that. It is still okay to insult and belittle Appalachian impoverished communities in a way that we don't culturally allow people to criticize other communities. And I think that's problematic. It's still okay for us to be a caricature as Appalachian people. Any other questions?
Let's see.
I was trying to scroll through the chat and see if I'd missed any.
Yeah, there's a lot of good positive comments, certainly. I got to check out that Saturday Night Live thing, because it really is, it's amazing. And was that a recent one, or is that like?
They've not done one in 6 or 7 years.
Okay.
And it's funny, every time I give the presentation all the time that includes that video, and I always have to go back and find a new link.
Yeah, in a culture of don't offend me, it's amazing that it's still there, I guess. But
yeah, yeah, and I don't tend to be one of those ultra sensitive people who's offended by everything. But you know, I am not a fan of making hay out of someone's tragedy or misfortune.
Yeah. Well, it's, Alicia points out, lazy show writers will
Yes,
fall back on insulting Appalachians.
it's an easy trope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I don't know who we can offend anymore, but
Yeah.
we're running out.
Do you, I don't know how to raise my hand. Sorry.
Oh yeah, that's okay, Becky. Go ahead.
Where do you think the negativity comes from with like the stereotypical white trash, and like where do you think that has roots in? Just from personal experience, I've dealt with it, that stereotype my whole life, and I grew up in Western Maryland, but it was very much Appalachia. It's very rural.
Yes, yeah, around Cumberland, right?
Yes, actually further west than that in Oakland.
Okay. Yeah, Cumberland is one of the most Appalachian cities I've ever spent time in, right? And so I will tell you, from a scholarly perspective, I think some of that fun making comes from a way of preserving power. Because if you look at the history of the United States, it has always been advantageous to have an impoverished class that struggles to ascend socioeconomically. And so a really great book that I would recommend is the book White Trash, a 400-year history of, I forget the subtitle, and the author's name just escaped me too. But if you look up the book White Trash, a 400-year history, you'll get it. I can't believe I'm blanking on the author because I actually assigned it in one of my classes. So, and actually, out of the corner of my eye, I'm looking out. I think I mentioned I live on a farm, and there's a pig in my yard, which means I'm going to have quite an issue to deal with fixing a fence when we get off this conference, right? But I really think, Becky, sort of to answer your question, Nancy Eisenberg, yes, thank you, Felicia. I really think that it's advantageous to have people who are sort of who are impoverished, but also who lack the ability to ascend out of that poverty. Because again, when we think about my presentation, it's very profitable for some people to have an impoverished class of people. There are people who will work for less than livable wages. There are people who will, by necessity, pay more for goods and services because they don't have any other choice. They lack the transportation or the resources otherwise. Can you imagine what a radical shift we would have in this country if all of a sudden everyone was middle class? A whole lot of people who have a whole lot of power would lose that power. Political leaders would lose that power. And so I think part of it is rooted in the notion of an inherent desire by some people to just belittle other people. I mean, I'll just be candid. Some people are just assholes, right? But some people also understand how to harness that assholery in other people to make sure that a class knows where their place is. It's a whole lot easier to pillage someone's resources and community when they feel inferior to everyone else. And if that's not the story of Appalachia, I don't know what is. And by the way, the line always is in the American South, you may be white trash, but at least you're not black. And that has always been the dividing line that has kept impoverished white people and impoverished black people from joining an effusion political coalition to have any political traction. The 1890s are a great example of that. In the 1890s, the state of North Carolina had a fusion coalition of impoverished whites and African Americans who elected a governor. The result was a coup in the city of Wilmington, where by violence, those who wanted to retain power kept it. That's a story for a different day and a long answer to your question, right? But I think the root of it is in the intersection of politics and power.
Okay, thank you.
We've got about another 5 minutes. If anybody's got any other questions or comments for Josh. Somebody did say something earlier. I'm saying I feel rich that my father occupied 2 hollers in Preston County. together and helped each other. Ohio and 56, a huge highway being built by our family.
And yes, thank you all for coming, even on a Saturday afternoon. I don't know what the weather is like where you all are, but it is absolutely beautiful here.
It's
it's
beautiful here. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have 7 hives of bees. And so I get to go do some beekeeping chores this afternoon.
Oh, good. Yeah. Keep them there.
Yeah.
I always like to hear about these things. I grew up in Jersey, and I was at when I moved down to West Virginia, I had went to church, and we had this little breakout session at church, and a lot of the people in my group were talking about how poor they were growing up, that their fathers were coal miners, and that they had didn't have a lot of money, and they had to trade shoes with their siblings. And they did a round thing. I mean, it went around. I don't even know what we were talking about, but everybody was talking about how they grew up in poverty, and it got to me, and I said, well, my father was a pretty successful lawyer. He was a mob lawyer, actually. I said, and we had we had a boat, we had a plane, we had horses, I said, so I grew up pretty rich. I said, I'm poor now. He stopped being an attorney back in the 70s. So I did grow up, scrambling, 4 boys in one room. So I mean, minor, but nothing to the extent of that. So I really appreciate your candor about it, and really getting a good insight into that, because I think it's really important to know. It's a culture that's that up until recently, with Vance's book and obviously your work and all that, people are starting to come to the highlights with, and it's important work, and I appreciate everybody who's stepping forward with that. So
yeah,
thank you, Josh.
Yeah, and Ravenna, I'll answer your question last, since we're almost out of time. To an extent, she valued education, but it's exactly what you point out. There's a skepticism of education because it leads to young people being the single largest export of Appalachia. And so she was okay with education to the point of she insisted that I finish high school, but she never took any move to push me toward going to college. And it was very near the end of her life, when I was 31, when I finally was able to go to college for the first time. So thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for your wonderful comments and questions. And I have a feeling I will be back next year. Maybe I'll finally get to come to West Virginia and see you all in person. That
would be wonderful.
I promise I'm better in person than I am on a Zoom screen.
You did beautifully. I appreciate it. Josh, before you leave, if you can switch the host back to me or to Brian, I guess, and we can...
Absolutely.
I don't know the whole connection in that, but I forgot to do it in one session. Nobody said anything, but...
Okay, you are now the host, Peter.
Look at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you all so much. Y'all take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.